So I'll be talking a little bit about the kind of interaction between southern resident killer whales and salmon, and particularly lack of prey as a potential risk factor for the whales. Just by way of background, sort of a reminder, the southern resident killer whales, like many other marine mammals, maybe most other marine mammal populations, were probably at a low point of abundance in the late 60s, early 70s, before they were protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. In addition to kind of the normal threats that they faced, they were also subject to a significant capture in the 50s and 60s, early 70s for the aquaria trade. Unlike many other marine mammal populations, they have generally failed to recover since then, and the kind of general categories of threats that they seem to face are potentially a lack of food, disturbance from living in a, or partially living anyway, in a fairly urban environment, and those two may interact. The disturbance, of course, may interfere with their foraging, which could contribute to their nutritional status. And then high contaminant levels, again, via their food sources. I will sort of mention, in addition to those three, I don't think that those are the exclusive threats. There are other factors impacting them, including potentially inbreeding depression. There's currently 76 whales in the population. Their effective population size is only about 25, and I think has been for probably the better part of a century. And we have some direct evidence of inbreeding. And then I also think just the sort of kind of bad luck factors that are possible in a small population, a string of poor years, a string of male births, that sort of thing, can actually have a big impact on a population of this size. They are one of half a dozen or so fish-eating killer whale populations that are strung around the Pacific Rim. They're the southernmost of these populations. And unlike most of the other ones, they haven't experienced a positive population trend. So you can see that in this figure here, where the southern residents are in kind of the purple. I don't know if I have a pointer or anything, but maybe I don't need it. You can see that. The southern residents are the population that's not growing. And by contrast, the northern resident population in British Columbia, which is sort of the next population at the north, has nearly tripled in population size over the same time period. And fish-eating populations in Alaska have increased strongly as well. Importantly, these populations probably have an overlapping diet, and they certainly have a similar ecology. So the southern residents are really kind of an anomaly in this sense. Just in order to kind of understand the relationship with specific salmon stocks and where those stocks may be coming from, it's important to have kind of just a general overview of the southern resident temporal and spatial distribution. This is kind of a gross simplification, but I think kind of covers it more or less, which is in the summer, the three pods, J, K, and L pod, tend to have a Salish Sea distribution, either in the Salish Sea itself or around Vancouver Island, northern Washington coast. And in the other seasons, fall, winter, and spring, they tend to be much more dispersed and range much more widely, with at least a recent pattern of K and L pods tending to be more coastally distributed, as far south as California, but seemingly spending quite a bit of time off the Washington coast. And then J pod being a little more northerly distributed, a little more Salish Sea oriented around Vancouver Island. All three pods are also occasionally found south of Admiralty Inlet in Puget Sound proper in the winter as well. So I'd like to now turn, I'm going to basically spend the rest of the talk talking a little bit about their diet and then about some of the trends in the salmon stocks that make up their diet. So on the, I guess the left, your left of this slide is a figure kind of summarizing some of the recent diet information that we and our colleagues, including Robin and Ken here in the room, have obtained with fecal samples from the whales. And in each of those panels, it shows the proportion of a species in their diet based on the fecal samples over the course of the year, running from October to October. Each dot in the panel corresponds to an individual fecal sample, so you can get a sense of kind of the sample size and where those are distributed throughout the seasons. And then the blue lines are a moving average of the proportion of that species over the time frame. So you can see that at the top, Chinook make up the bulk of their diet and never falling much below, on average, 50% of their diet. And it's close to 100% in midsummer in July, say late July, August. It tends to decline a little bit with the spring, where you get a ramp up in coho salmon up to about 50% of their diet in September and early October. And then a little bit of a transition to chum in later October, November, December, where chum can make up to about 50% of their diet. And then a quite diverse diet in the midwinter time period, January through March, where salmonids still make up the bulk of their diet, but you start seeing a fair bit of non-salmonids, such as lingcod and halibut. So my inference from this would be that they strongly prefer Chinook salmon, and when they can't get Chinook salmon, they tend to turn to other salmonids, and when they can't find other salmonids, then they diversify their diet into other fish species. This would also suggest, and there's some other evidence to this, that the winter time period where their diet is more diverse is probably also where they're having a little bit of a harder time finding their preferred prey items. So we also have a fair bit of information on the stock identification of the Chinook salmon in their diet. So this is a figure from a paper that we published a few years ago on this for their summer diet. And basically in the summertime period in the Salish Sea area, the Chinook that they're consuming is largely from the Fraser River, about 85% from the Fraser River, and then the remaining being from Puget Sound and areas around Vancouver Island. And they pretty much follow the runs as they come in. So in May, June, early July, they're eating these upper river Fraser stocks. These are spring run stocks. They transition to summer run stocks in summer and fall run stocks later in late summer and fall. So they kind of take them as they come in. We have, this is largely work by Brad Hansen and colleagues at the Northwest Center and our collaborators. Collected a fair bit of information at this point on the winter diet, both while they're in Puget Sound and a more limited sampling out on the outer coast, particularly Washington and Northern California. To kind of summarize a fair bit of this, when they're in Puget Sound in the winter, about 65% of the Chinook that they're consuming in Puget Sound proper, so this is south of Admiralty Inlet, is Chinook from Puget Sound. So these would be a mixture of mostly South Sound stocks and some North Sound stocks. The remainder is a smattering of a whole bunch of other stocks, the Fraser River, Vancouver Island, Strait of Georgia, and then some actually non-Salish Sea stocks that they may bring in with them, perhaps, since some of this is based on fecal samples from the outer coast, including the Columbia, Sacramento, Klamath. When they are out on the outer coast, particularly the Washington coast, they're eating a diverse group of stocks. About 50% are Chinook from the Columbia River, and of those, it's mostly the lower Columbia River, at least in the samples that we have, including lower Columbia Springs, Tule Fall Chinook, upriver Bright Fall Chinook. And then the remaining half of the stocks are basically from all over the coast, including the Fraser River, Puget Sound, Sacramento, and Klamath as the primary contributors. And these are, for the most part, what you might expect them to be eating when they're at the outer coast. Those stock groupings, if not the exact proportions, pretty much match what you would see in the spring fisheries, for example, and in some of the genetic stock ID data that is collected from the fisheries off the coast. So I think Eric is going to cover most of this, but I did want to just mention, since we are in this session, some of the potential increases in prey consumption by marine mammals on salmon over time. So as I mentioned, the southern resident killer whales are really an anomaly. Most marine mammal populations have been increasing, including other killer whale populations that feed on some of the same salmon stocks, and including pinnipeds, which, although they have salmon as a relatively small proportion of their diet, because of their large abundance and biomass, can actually consume a fair bit of salmon. That's sideways. So let's see if this one worked. So this was a paper that a large number of collaborators, led by Brandon Chasko, published last year. that basically tried to estimate the total salmon consumption, Chinook salmon consumption over time of marine mammal predators across the entire West Coast. This was a purely bioenergetics approach, basically looking at estimates of diet and estimates of metabolism and numbers of animals and kind of multiplying that all together to come up with an estimate of salmon consumed. And the bottom line here is that basically the estimated consumption of salmon from around the mid-70s to the present has roughly doubled at the same time period that the fishery has roughly halved. So basically the two sort of cancel each other out in terms of overall salmon abundance. And I think Eric will be talking more about this. I did want to touch a little bit on some of the direct evidence for nutritional stress in the southern resident killer whales. And this largely comes from direct observation, either of the whales on the water or from the air with some of the photogrammetry work led out of the Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And I think the sort of, I'm not going to summarize this in detail, but basically the kind of current thinking on this is that the southern residents tend to be skinnier than other fish-eating populations, particularly the northern resident population, suggesting that they're in poorer body shape. And then there's some evidence of seasonal change with the whales being in somewhat better shape in the spring, or sorry, in the summer, late summer, than they are in the spring when they come into the Salish Sea. Again, kind of suggesting, along with the diet data, that winter could be a harder time for them. And then Robin quoted from either this paper or another paper from Sam Wasser and company looking at hormonal changes in the whales, which also suggests some evidence of nutritional stress. I guess when thinking about this, I do want to kind of emphasize that the kind of causality in all this is not really firmly established, and that it's sort of clear that there are some whales in poor condition, but whether they're in poor condition because they are nutritionally stressed or whether they're nutritionally stressed because they're in poor condition for some other reason, I think is still a little bit unclear. So just to kind of summarize the whale part of this, the southern resident population is not growing, unlike other populations with an overlapping diet. Their diet is clearly heavily dependent on Chinook salmon. They eat a lot of different stocks, all the way from California to BC, including some stocks that are some very large hatchery stocks, which I'll get to in a minute. I didn't touch on this, but there are some correlations between whale survival and birth rates and salmon, although those correlations are actually weakening over time compared to what they were about 10 years ago. There is some evidence of nutritional stress, and then finally just a reminder that this prey availability is a factor of both salmon abundance and probably also access to those salmon, and so other factors like disturbance could impact nutritional status as well. So with that, I wanted to turn quickly to kind of an overview of salmon status, and I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about historical abundance, long and short-term trends, and the focus here will be entirely on Chinook salmon, since that seems to be kind of their preferred salmon in their diet. So historically, the Columbia River was the major, and is still a major, source of Chinook salmon on the West Coast. These estimates are somewhat tentative and can be controversial, but based on cannery pack estimates in the early 1900s, late 1800s, probably upwards of 4 million Chinook salmon returned to the Columbia River, compared to kind of peak run sizes now of up to about 1 million on a good year. Other areas, such as Puget Sound and the Central Valley, were also major Chinook salmon producers. And in all three cases, particularly Central Valley and the Columbia River, the current abundance is at a pretty small fraction of its historical abundance. One thing that's really important to recognize is that many of these losses are due to extirpations rather than declines in abundance of extant stocks. So particularly in the Columbia River, for example, large fractions of the Columbia are simply blocked by impassable dams, Grand Coulee, the Hills Canyon complex. And so those populations at the moment are lost altogether. It's possible that they could be recovered, but they're not currently, for example, part of the ESA listings. And there's many, many smaller extirpations that have occurred throughout the coast. I do think it's sort of also important to realize that many of these losses and the big declines in abundance occurred a long time ago. really in the late 1800s and early 1900s with the sort of rapid expansion of European settlement of the area. So you can really see this, for example, in just the trends to the Columbia River. These are the counts of Chinook salmon over Bonneville Dam from 1938 to the present, one of the longest time series of Chinook salmon abundance available. And if you look at this, it's not obvious that this is a disaster at all, in the sense that, abundance is actually quite a bit higher in the last 20 years than it was any time in the previous 70. As you recall, the total abundance historically was probably about 4 million. And so the inference here is that the big decline occurred prior to 1938, not afterwards. And it's also important to realize that in some areas things may in fact have improved compared to what they were in the early 20th century. So these are some photographs from the upper Columbia River, for example, where the Chinook salmon populations and populations like the Wenatchee, the Entiat, and the Methow were largely extirpated in the early part of the 20th century. And so there's actually probably more salmon in those populations now than there were then. Here's kind of a coast-wide trend of adult Chinook salmon that could potentially be available to the whales from basically 1980 to the present. These are data put together by Robert Cope at the Science Center based on Pacific Salmon Commission data and models. And the blue in this trend is the terminal run of adult salmon back to near their rivers of origin. So that would include fish that escape to the spawning grounds and also fish that are harvested in the rivers or in the areas right near the river mouths. And then the red in this graph is the ocean fishery catch. That's the kind of impact of catching fish out in the ocean before they get back to near the river mouths. And what you can kind of see over time is that there's not really an obvious trend in salmon over this time period. And if anything, the overall trend to the terminal areas has actually improved somewhat. And you can see that the catch has generally gone down over this time period. This obscures a lot of detail, of course, which I'm not going to get into here. But one sort of little bit of detail that I think is of interest to the whales is that in general, the Salish sea stocks have been down a little bit over this time period. And in general, coastal stocks, particularly to the Columbia, have been up a little bit over this time period. Stocks to California have also been down, particularly in recent years. One of the kind of important things that I think is really important to emphasize on here is the importance of hatchery production, and you can really see this in the Puget Sound time series. So this is basically the same data, but just for Chinook salmon returning to Puget Sound. The historical estimate was maybe 600,000 to 700,000 Chinook returning to Puget Sound, and you can see that even as late as recently as the 80s and almost into the 90s, the total run size, including catch, was somewhat near that. It's down somewhat since then. But it's important to realize that about 80% or more of that is originating from hatchery production. And the whales are almost certainly taking advantage of some of that. It's important to realize that it's also not just about abundance, but diversity. This shows sort of the relative changes in run timing from historical estimates to present size. And I'm not going to get into too much of the detail here, but just to emphasize that particularly spring runs have been impacted more than fall runs overall along the coast, again, largely due to inaccessible habitat. This is particularly true on the Columbia River, where there used to be several million spring Chinook returning to the river, and now it's in the hundreds of thousands. And you see a similar pattern in Puget Sound, where fall run Chinook is probably at or close to historical abundance, again, largely due to large-scale hatchery production, but spring run is much lower than historical abundance. Same thing in the Central Valley. Even within hatcheries, there's been some reduction in diversity over time. So this is a paper that Eric Ward and Ben Nelson at the Science Center have in preparation right now, looking at patterns of Salish Sea Chinook salmon hatchery diversity over time. And basically, there's an overall trend towards sort of conformity, if you will, in both release time and release size of hatchery Chinook over time, which again may contribute to vulnerability to particularly Pinniped predation. And then finally, another aspect of diversity that's changing is changes in size. So this is a recent paper by Olberger et al. From the University of Washington, looking at patterns of Chinook salmon age and size at age over time. And basically, particularly for the older fish, 4-, 5-, 6-year-old fish, there's sort of a marked reduction in size over time. I hypothesize a number of potential factors for this, one of which, in fact, is potentially killer whale predation. As killer whale populations have recovered, and as they eat some of the larger Chinook, it's possible that that's exerting a downward pressure on salmon size. I'd like to briefly talk about salmon recovery efforts. These largely are based on habitat restoration, changes in harvest level and strategy, and changes in hatchery production, improvements to dams and dam passage, and in some cases dam removal, and reintroductions into extirpated areas. I can't get into this in great detail other than to kind of point out that it's a fairly extensive effort, even though it doesn't come probably close to what's fully needed. But there's something like many tens of thousands of habitat projects scattered across the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Salmon Recovery Fund spends roughly $60 million on habitat restoration annually. The Columbia River Bonneville Power spends at least that much annually on habitat restoration. So that's sort of one major effort. Hatcheries, for the most part, have been evaluated as both a risk and a benefit to wild salmon populations. In general, hatchery production has been reduced over the last 15 to 20 years, partly due to funding issues, but partly due to concerns for wild salmon conservation. In general, the sort of strategy is to try to promote the use of hatcheries in a way that allows for both some of their conservation benefits to wild populations and fishery benefits while trying to minimize the impacts to wild populations. Harvest is sort of one of the easier levers in the salmon management realm to turn, and it has been turned quite a bit. So here's two examples of sort of major reductions in harvest due to ESA status of listed salmon. One example is Hood Canal summer chum, which historically were harvested at very high harvest rates, upward of 60%, down to relatively minimal rates in the mid-90s. Another example would be fall Chinook in the Columbia River. Again, kind of a very high harvest rates in the 80s and early 90s, reduced to more moderate rates, partly as a result of ESA listings. And you can see that in the overall coastwide trend as well. Those red bars are the ocean harvest of Chinook salmon, and in general, the proportion of the total run that is harvested has declined by about half over the last 30 or 40 years. There's been quite a large number of dam removals in the Pacific Northwest as part of salmon recovery, most notably around this area, the Elwha Dam, but it's one of many. Klamath dams are scheduled to come out as well, so sort of a major kind of renaissance in access to salmon in those cases. And then a large number of attempts to introduce salmon above currently impassable dams, particularly in the Willamette River and portions of Puget Sound, as part of salmon recovery efforts. One kind of element that I think is really important to consider in all of this is climate change. And a lot of this work may be kind of a Red Queen kind of situation where we're kind of working as hard as we can just to kind of maintain things in the face of this threat. Most of the work on the freshwater side of salmon and climate change suggests that that'll be very bad for salmon, basically increasing stream temperatures, lack of changing in snowpack regimes are likely to result in fairly significant damage to current salmon runs, particularly because some of the more refuge areas in the upper watersheds are often currently inaccessible. One big kind of wild card is what's going to happen in the ocean with climate change. We know from time series like the PDO and the ENSO that ocean conditions play an enormous role, probably the biggest role, in annual changes in salmon abundance. What we don't know at this point is sort of how climate change is going to impact those. We had a little bit of a taste of this in last year with the warm blob in the North Pacific. We're still sort of understanding the effects of that. It's sort of unclear what that'll be on salmon, but based on returns this year and predicted returns for next year, it could be a fairly major effect. So just to kind of summarize, Salmon have not really been continuously declining. A lot of the really big declines occurred 100 years ago or more. Recovery back to historical abundance is very much not just an ESA issue, partly due to a lot of the extirpations and partly due to ESA recovery goals being fairly far below historical levels. Hatchery abundance, I think, is a major factor to think about when thinking about the southern resident killer whales and basically salmon in the Pacific ecosystem right now. Chinook salmon, hatchery Chinook salmon are a majority of the Chinook returning to the Sacramento, the Columbia, and the Puget Sound. There's also massive hatchery programs in Alaska for pink and chum salmon. So when you think about salmon in the Pacific, you have to think about hatchery production. Some of the salmon recovery actions have actually reduced abundance of salmon to focus on wild salmon rather than hatchery salmon. And then finally, I think restoring diversity is really important. It's not all about abundance. There's been a much greater loss of spring run populations than fall run. The whales utilize a wide variety of stocks right now, and I think they could probably utilize a wider variety of stocks were they available. I think one thing we need to be careful of is not equating the current diet necessarily with an optimum diet. There could be stocks that are at low abundance now that could be really important to the whales. And then finally, marine mammals as a group have recovered fairly strongly and are estimated to consume quite a lot of salmon. And so that's another factor to consider. That's what I have. I'll turn it over.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I think we'll just move on to the second presentation. Thanks, Eric.
Okay. Well, good morning, Chair, Boness, and Commission. And again, my name is Eric Netherland, and it's a great presentation by Mike. And I had a lot of help putting this presentation together from Steve Jeffries and also Scott Pearson, who is they're our real experts on Pinnipeds. So I'll be presenting some of this info. Really, I'm going to start and end with this slide right here, which are the takeaways. And Mike talked a lot about this, so I'll try and breeze through some of the things that Mike talked about. Pinnipeds have increased in Puget Sound, and we've all the data and studies are indicating that they're having an increased impact on salmon populations. And that's by the second bullet. So pinniped predation on salmon and steelhead has increased from the evidence that we looked at. I'll review briefly the Chasco paper that Mike talked about. But the other points I want to make this morning are that predation is just one of many factors that are impacting salmon and steelhead in Puget Sound. It might be an important one, but the fourth bullet there is one thing that we're learning, and not just in Puget Sound, but across the North Pacific, is that we really need an integrated program to address predation and other factors, and we really have to think about this mechanistically with all the changes that are happening. So that's just an outline of what I just talked about, so I'll go through that, and I'll talk a little bit about the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project, and then some work that's going on. So I'm going to go through the Pinniped piece first. So I'll talk about harbor seals first. Now, I know that most of you know more than I do about some of this, but I thought it would be helpful to just have a background on what's known and do a brief summary for discussions today. So you'll see a lot of graphs like this in terms of their abundance over time. So it's just a lot of these are regressions or log regressions, and they have a count on the left side. And then it's a time series, but a lot of these end at 2000, so a lot of these data need updated. But the point here is when the line is going up, you'll see that's an increase, and when it starts to level out, that's some indication that they've hit some maybe carrying capacity or some leveling out. So this is just an example from Puget Sound, but I'm going to this is all those graphs, so I just want to present that one so it wasn't so confusing. But you can see on the west coast of Washington, you've seen increases with some leveling out of the individual populations for that stock, and at about 16 to 19,000 individuals. When we move over to the Washington inland stocks, which are there in the middle, you've got about 14 to 16,000 overall, and you can see there some places are leveling out, most places. And then in British Columbia, from a recent report, those data go out a little longer, but anywhere from 91 to 119,000 harbor seals. And then briefly, just distribution for harbor seals. So this is these are counts done at haul-outs in other areas just to look at distribution, but really most of the animals are concentrated in northern Puget Sound around San Juan Islands and in the Strait of Georgia. And again, this is looking at the inland stock. Just a reminder of that, 14 to 16,000 in Puget Sound there, with some distribution as you move down into southern Puget Sound. And then for diet, most of the diet data that we're working from are taken from the Strait of Georgia, and actually the data that was used in the Chasco paper, most of that was harbor seal data we're taking from the Strait of Georgia. So we're taking information from pretty far north. But you can see that salmon made up from the 90s. So the couple things to take away from this slide are there's a time series. So looking at the Strait of Georgia from 1990s to 2017, salmon was almost 4% to 9% of the diet, and Chinook made up 6% of that salmon part. And then in 2017, it looks like maybe they looked at juveniles and adults and maybe a slight increase. But as you move into the San Juans, that number is at 2%. So lower salmon in the diet for Chinook. Now we'll move on to California sea lions. Here's just a population trend. You've seen for California sea lions, they have a growth rate of about 5.4% per year. But those data, we lack data for the recent range-wide abundance trend. So it's a little more recent than the harbor seal, but you can see that line's continuing to go up, and it's whether it's going to keep increasing or is it going to level out is sort of the question we want to answer. And then, as you all know, California sea lions, they breed in the spring off the islands of California and Mexico, and so as a result, their abundance, in that time of year decreases, and I think they've left the area now, and they won't be back for a couple more months. And that's just the Pacific Northwest seasonal distribution that just demonstrates that. So if you follow it from summer, fall, winter, spring, you see in the summer and the spring those distributions are, in summer it's non-existent, and then they return in the fall. And then for sea lion diet, looked at salmon make up 5 to 25% of their diet, but the measurements for this are frequency of occurrence. I'm not going to get into many details, and Steve's here if we have more detailed questions, but essentially it's a measure. They're just looking to detect, looking at hard parts, was that hard part detected in a diet? So it's really more of a measure of how many sea lions are eating salmon, and rather than just a percentage of their diet. But as you get enough samples, those two measures converge. I think the point there is that you're likely to, at low sample sizes, likely to overestimate the percentage of the diet with this methodology, so just something to keep in mind, but still 5 to 25% for the California sea lions. So if we look at stellar sea lions and look at those trends, they've increased off Oregon, Northern California, and Washington. Similar, these are linear regressions. So continuing to increase with not real leveling off. And then here's their seasonal distribution. So unlike California sea lions, the stellar sea lions move around, but they're still more present off the Washington coast and Vancouver, and don't move south. And then their diet, for salmon, it's about 10% of their overall diet, and that range changes seasonally, so lower in the spring than it is in the fall, so 7 to 10%. And then Chinook composed about 18% of those, of the salmon. So just a quick summary of the Pinniped piece. So the Pinnipeds increases, but they have increased, but especially for harbor seals, it looks like their populations are at carrying capacity. And I'm not going to present any information, but there are some new data coming from DFW and the Navy that would would support that, so that those data aren't fully analyzed, but it looks like this. Harbor seals in Puget Sound are leveling off or maybe even slightly declining. Salmon are important, but it's important to remember they're a small proportion of the pinniped diet overall, but they can have a large impact when there are a lot of the individuals. So, and then there's evidence that pinniped distributions are changing, so so we had neat updated information on abundance, distribution, and diet. And the point there is that just like with what I'll talk about a little later, we're seeing a lot of changes, and some of them are due to our behaviors, and some of them are due to the natural environment. So it's really sometimes difficult to tease that apart. Here's an interesting graph that I pulled out of Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada report. So they did a reconstruction of historical harbor seal abundance. They did this by looking at actual harvest of harbor seals, and then they also looked at killing of harbor seals by recreational and commercial fishermen over the years. So just interesting to think about how the numbers of harbor seals were really low in 1970, and they're up above what they were in the 1880s. So it's just, I thought that was an interesting and telling graph. So I'm going to shift quickly to the Chasco paper that Mike mentioned. And just to repeat what he said, it was his coast-wide spatiotemporal bioenergetics model. And it really estimated this consumption of Chinook from 70s to 2015, and it looked at all those the whales and pinnipeds there and compared it with Chinook abundance. And then it also looked at harvest, and then it looked at Chinook with and without predation. But here are some key takeaways. Predation has increased significantly from 6 to 15 metric tons, so that's anywhere from 5 to 32 million individual fish, so quite an increase. And one of the things to take away from the paper was that killer whales are consuming the largest biomass, but harbor seals are consuming the most individuals. And then, as Mike mentioned, the commercial and recreational fishing has declined, and that's declined from 16 to 10 metric tons. And then they also mentioned that predation could be masking the benefits of recovery, because if you're increasing salmon through recovery, well, you might not see those benefits because those fish are being eaten by predators. So now I'm going to shift to this marine survival in the Salish Sea, because at the same time you had killer whales have been declining. You had increases in pinniped populations. You also had marine survival of coho, chinook, and steelhead declining in the Salish Sea, and this information started to come to the surface in 2012, but maybe a little earlier. And what you're looking at in those graphs, those aren't trends, those aren't abundance trends, those are trends in marine survival. So that's when they leave the freshwater until they return back to spawn, that whole marine phase. And in the blue is Puget Sound. So for coho, the blue all the way through for Puget Sound, and the red is for the Strait of Georgia. So this isn't just a Puget Sound issue. This is an issue that's Salish Sea-wide. I don't show that. So what happened is you had this decline, and then this continual chronically low level of marine survival in Puget Sound, or the Salish Sea. What I'm not showing here is on the coast populations and elsewhere, you did have a decline, but you see an increase in that marine survival. But in Salish Sea, you're not seeing that same pattern. So along with those patterns, there have been these other significant changes in the Salish Sea, which we've lost forage fish species, other fish species, and then eelgrass, kelp. We've seen a shift in food web to a less nutritious zooplankton and phytoplankton. So that's on the decrease side. On the increase side, we've already talked about pinnipeds. We've seen increases in harbor porpoise as well, and moving their distribution further into Puget Sound. We've seen an increase in pink salmon. This is North Pacific wide. I've seen an increase in jellies, maybe related to less nutritious food web. increases in temperature and population growth. And so all these things are happening at the same time that we're seeing these declines in southern resident killer whales. So this in part, and in large part, all of this that I just talked about with Salish Sea marine survival led to this international collaborative research project that's being led in the U.S. by Long Live the Kings, and then on the Canadian side by Pacific Salmon Foundation. And this is really it's a 5-year research project that's nearing the end of that field research, and we'll go into more of a report writing phase. $20 million project for both Canada and U.S. And it looks at both top-down drivers, so looking at predation and other factors, as well as bottom-up food web drivers. So it's looking from the top down, from the bottom up, and then it also is looking at modeling, looking at integrated ecosystem modeling. So it's really trying to get at what's happening in Puget Sound and the Salish Sea. And so one thing that we're finding as part of this project is that there are many factors at play for salmon and steelhead survival. And so here are just some of the key points that this research has led to. And really there's a lot here, and you could do a whole presentation on this. And so if interested, be happy to come back later and talk about this. But here are the key take-homes. One is climate change and population growth are having an impact with changing water temperatures and just increased nutrients disrupting, and it looks like it's really disrupting these food webs, the food base. We're also finding that estuarine habitat, so that's in the estuary, but also food in the near shore moving out from the estuary. It's this critical growth period for Chinook, and it's really linked to increase in adult survival when you have those pieces. I was just at a conference with many of the premier scientists across the North Pacific, and they are finding that this nearshore environment is very important, and even if you're, it's just driving some of the survival that's happening in the ocean. So it's interesting that we're finding these similar results in Salish Sea. So to me, that's something that we really need to focus on. Contaminants and parasites in Puget Sound, high levels of flame retardants in Chinook, and high levels of parasite loads in steelhead has been linked with poor survival through this study. And also we're finding that forage fish in Puget Sound is acting as a buffer prey, and I'm going to show an example of that in a minute, and then I'll talk a little bit about predation. So I'm just going to focus on these last 2 points, and then I'll be wrapping up here soon. But the first one is just an example of one of the findings that I think is really insightful and might sort of demonstrate what we're learning. And then the next one on predation, I'll just talk about some work that the department's doing as part of this project, and then I'll wrap up. So one thing that we've been looking for, this is for steelhead, so not for Chinook, but this is looking at marine survival for steelhead. And so this on the left is just their survival out of Puget Sound. So it takes steelhead about 3 weeks to migrate through Puget Sound as juveniles, and they spend 1 to 3 years in the freshwater. So this is when they enter the Puget Sound. In 2006, there were some studies looking at acoustic telemetry and whatnot, and survival was a little over 10%. That means 10% of the individuals that went into Puget Sound made it all the way to the Straits. That's what that means. So it started to decline in 2008, 2009, which was part of the reason that this Salish Sea project got going. The legislature funded work specifically on steelhead in 2013, and so we were able to kick this study back up. And when we started the study in 2014, saw very low levels of survival. We had 6% of the, so 6% of the steelhead that make it out of fresh water were making it out to the ocean. So in 3 weeks' time, we were losing 94% of the fish. That is that's a huge number. And then in 2015, we saw the survival increase, and that increased almost to 18%. So 18% of the fish leaving Puget Sound. And then in 2016, we saw almost 40% of the fish that were entering, say, in the Squally, making it all the way through Puget Sound out to the Pacific Ocean. So we have this huge increase in survival for steelhead. All these other factors were still at play, but we started looking at what other things had changed. And one thing, anchovies move into and out of Puget Sound, but there was this really large increase of forage fish in Puget Sound, and especially a big push of anchovies into Puget Sound. Maybe, people have speculated on different reasons, maybe the blob, but nonetheless, there was this big push of anchovies into Puget Sound, so forage fish for seals, and we had this increase in survival. So this isn't conclusive. This is just a correlation, or just kind of looking for some patterns. But the point being is that we had this increase and this decrease in a salmon population without really doing much to the predators, but we affected the food. So to me, it's just an indication that there are a lot of things going on here. And so really understanding mechanistically what is happening, especially in Puget Sound, is going to be important if we're really going to address the problem. So with that, I'll just end with this pinniped predation assessment. So this is really the next step. We have these trends in abundance. We understand about their diets. Chasco came out with this paper that said region-wide we're having, pinnipeds are having a huge impact on our Chinook populations. But when we try and regionalize that paper, we try and localize those results. You really can't do anything from a management perspective. You really have to go out and understand more locally what those predation rates might be, what the abundances might be. So this is an effort to look at that. So we want to update pinniped abundance by region and season. We want to get new estimates and update our estimates for diet by region and month, and then estimate daily energy demands. So here's just an example of some of the data that we're trying to bring to the table. And this is for looking at reconstructing diets from scat. We're using hard parts and DNA methods. And Steve actually over there is the one that's collected a majority of the data, these scat samples. And then there's some preliminary results from 2016, but we're going to continue to move forward. We're collecting samples this year, and we'll be analyzing those data. But what we're seeing is salmon is less than 5% of the harbor seal diet, and Chinook is less than 2% of their diet. Very early, I would call these preliminary, not really quotable, but just wanted to share a little bit of that. The next steps on that process we'll use updated population estimates. So we're like I mentioned earlier, DFW and the Navy are in the process of collecting more current data on population estimates. Then we'll use these new pinniped diet data that I just described from a few different sources. And then we'll provide some new Chinook and adult consumption estimates, and we'll include both availability of wild and hatchery Chinook, include uncertainty in pinniped diets, and include uncertainty in pinniped population estimates. So one thing I think about with hatchery and wild, so Mike mentioned that we've seen a decrease in hatchery production. An estimate just came out across the North Pacific. 40% of the salmon in the North Pacific are of hatchery origin right now. That's the current estimate. So takeaways, this is where we started. This is where I will end. Pinnipeds have increased in Puget Sound, but appear to have leveled off in Puget Sound or maybe declining. Predation on salmon and steelhead has increased. I don't think there's any reason to think it hasn't. But again, predation is just one of many factors impacting salmon and steelhead, and we really need an integrated program to address this, which is what we're trying to do on many fronts. And with that, I thank you. Maybe just one more point. I keep mentioning, I was actually at this conference in Russia with other scientists, and it's amazing, and part of the talk was thinking about climate change and what people are seeing. And it's actually, even though I work in this every day and I think frequently about climate change, to hear some of the scientists talking about the changes that they're seeing in the Arctic and how quickly those changes are happening, and how they're seeing salmon species, pink and chum, colonize the Arctic up in Canada and Alaska, is, to me, it was just sort of rang the alarm bell even more. And then, I mentioned this growth in the early phase of the salmon. It seems to be something that many people are pointing to as important. So I think it needs some investigation. And then, just understanding mechanistically, because a lot of the models that folks are using to try and understand these species are not really holding up with the changes that we're seeing. And so really understanding, in the Arctic, they're trying to understand how the sea ice is affecting food web, which is then affecting pollock, which is then affecting pink salmon. It's very complicated. And but the work that they're doing is revealing, and so I think we can get there with research. So with that, I will end.
Thank you very much to both the speakers. We're a bit over time, but if the chair agrees, we'll have a few questions. Questions from the commissioners?
Yeah, so looking from both talks here, the comments on climate change, the impacts of climate change, I wonder to what extent those impacts are swamping out impacts from, say, pinniped predators, so that the huge focus on pinnipeds may actually not get us very far if that is indeed true.
And you have to hold down that mic.
I think that a lot of the climate change impacts are yet to be felt, and I think some of the pinniped impacts are being felt kind of right now. So I think a really good example of that would be at the Willamette, where pinniped predation on steelhead at the Willamette Falls is a huge deal right now. The modeling that I've seen on climate change for the Willamette suggests that, by 2050 or so, a lot of the currently accessible habitat in the Willamette is going to be very inhospitable to salmon, and you're really going to need to get them up above what are now more or less impassable dams into cooler water. So I think it's a sort of a temporal. I think both are important. The pinnipeds are happening right now. Climate change is going to be a big deal 20 or 30 years from now.
Sue?
Yeah, just to follow on that, I was just curious about the Canada-U.S. program. How much of that is focused on climate change, or how does climate change, how is it included in that program?
Climate change is looked at just as a part of the overall program, so it's looking at time series and looking at how food abundances may have changed, but also it's about collecting empirical data and then looking at climate change more through an integrated ecosystem modeling. So that's how it's going to be incorporated, is through modeling of the current data that we're collecting and then understanding maybe what historic data were.
All right. Any other questions? I think we'll probably move on to the next session then. So thank you again for our speakers, and I think both of you are going to be around the rest of the day. So.
Okay, we're going to narrow the focus a little bit now and talk about specifically pinniped predation on salmon in the Columbia River. We're a little bit behind, so I'm not going to say much, and we're probably going to go a little bit into our break. This is obviously not a new issue. We've got some folks here, at least Steve Jeffries, who's been working on this for multiple decades. It's a complex problem. We've already got a sense of that from the talks we've had already this morning. And there's a lot to talk about. So in the interest of being focused, we're going to talk in the next session specifically, as I said, about pinniped predation in the Columbia River, and we're going to start with Robert Anderson talking about Bonneville Dam, then Brian Wright talking about issues at Willamette Falls and the dam, and then our own Mike Gosseliner speaking about pending legislation to address the problem. So I'm not sure which, I'm just going to click on one of these and see if it's the...
Should be the first one.
Should be the first one? Yeah, okay, so first up is Robert Anderson speaking about Bonneville Dam, and he is from NOAA Fisheries Northwest Region.
Thanks, Jason, and good morning, everyone. Anyway, Mike asked if I would give a summary of what's gone on at Bonneville Dam and just sort of the process over time. So I'll do that and try to keep it brief so we can stay on schedule, but try to give you enough information that sets us up for hopefully a good panel discussion. So as you're probably aware, the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the 94 Amendment added a provision that was the Pinniped Removal Authority, and it specifically is to address pinniped predation issues on salmonid fishery stocks that are either listed, approaching that status, or migrate through Ballard Locks in Seattle. So at least here on the West Coast, we've issued 4 letters of authorization to the states for Bonneville Dam. 2016 was the most recent 5-year authorization that we issued to the states. There was one in 2008, 2011, and 2012. And just sort of, there's 16 terms and conditions, but kind of a key one that gets into the criteria to put an animal on the list that qualifies it for removal is that they have to be observed eating a salmonid. They have to have been in the vicinity of Bonneville Dam for at least 5 days in any configuration and having been subjected to non-lethal hazing. In addition to that, once they meet that criteria and they're individually identifiable, they then also have to make their way into the traps that the states set up, and then they have to stay in there when the door is closed, and then we go through a process of making sure that that animal is qualified for removal, has met the conditions, and so take it from there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about briefly the status of salmon and steelhead. At least for Bonneville Dam and the Pinniped removal program, there's 5 stocks of salmonids that are really the focus here, and these are the ones that are listed here: the Upper Columbia River spring Chinook, which are endangered, Snake River Basin spring summer Chinook, Snake River Basin steelhead, Middle Columbia River steelhead, and the Lower Columbia River steelhead. And you can see sort of a graphic here on sort of population trends of hatchery and natural origin Chinook. This is for the Upper Columbia River spring run Chinook salmon. There's 3 populations that comprise that ESU. You can see that there's been a pretty significant decline that really occurred in sort of the mid-90s. The red line are the interim recovery abundance targets. So you can see that we're pretty well below that mark as it is right now. Some of the other stocks are doing a little bit better, like Middle Columbia River steelhead has a little higher trajectory, but not all populations are near or meeting any of their recovery targets. The graphic to your left that shows, or to your right that shows the run timing and the 5 stocks that are of principal concern, and you can see that overlap with the pinniped presence there at Bonneville Dam. That's mostly California sea lions. I won't get too much into sort of the evolution of what's happened with stellar sea lions, but I'll touch on that a little bit, but wanted to sort of give a snapshot here of sort of the status of salmon and steelhead in the Columbia Basin, and you compare that to the status of California sea lions. And this was a recent publication that, shows that, since the early 70s, that the trajectory of the population of California sea lions, the U.S. population has steadily increased, and in fact, the determination of OSP, which is really a conservation success. I mean, it is sort of the goal of the MMPA is to manage those animals within that range. Due to a variety of factors, particularly the unusual mortality events that occurred in the last few years, that population has dipped down from its high in 2012, but is still very robust and very strong. This doesn't really capture sort of what happens necessarily with the males that are really part of this aggregation. There's probably 40 to 50,000 of them that transit the Northeast Pacific Ocean, and a few of those make their way into the Columbia River and up into Puget Sound. But again, sort of the population at large, appears to be, doing robust and quite healthy. So this is a graph that just shows Pinniped observed minimum estimations at Bonneville Dam from 2002 to 2017. The observations there at the dam really started to occur in, I think, 2001, and then they started to sort of keep track of individual pinnipeds, either those that had natural or applied features. You can see that it was relatively steady for California sea lions until 2015, when there was a huge influx of California sea lions into the Columbia River estuary. I think that year there were pretty close to 4,000 California sea lions that had made it into the Columbia River, where previously I think the average was somewhere between 400 to 800 a year. And that happened again in 2016, down a little bit in 2017, and I think that that's continued to decrease this year. I don't have any data for that, but I think we're probably under 1,000 as a maximum count for the Columbia River. I think importantly to note out here, in addition to the California sea lions, is the influx and increase of stellar sea lions. So while we've been managing California sea lions at Bonneville Dam through the lethal removal program, with the recovery of stellar sea lions, the eastern stock, and their delisting in 2015, and their presence at Bonneville Dam has, increased, and also the duration is much longer. They tend to come back late summer and spend the winter there as well. So they aren't just targeting the spring and summer run fish. They're also starting to hit some of the fall run fish. So just a quick snapshot of pinniped predation in the Pacific Northwest, just to go back in time a little bit here locally to Ballard Locks. That predation between 86 and 1992 consumed between 42 and 65% of the Lake Washington winter steelhead run. That population is considered functionally extinct. I think the last data I saw for any fish counts was back in 2011, and I don't know that there's been any that have been documented since then. At Bonneville Dam, since 2002, the estimates of consumption of the 5 at-risk salmonids has ranged from a low of 0.35% to a high of 4.17 in 2007, with an estimate of 1.86 in 2017. Consumption of at-risk salmonids at Bonneville by all pinnipeds, California sea lions, and stellar sea lions range from the low of 0.35 in 2002 to a high of 5.5% in 2016, with a small drop to 4.5% in 2017. And Brian will get into this a little bit more, but at Willamette Falls, the consumption of the two at-risk stocks there has ranged from a low of 7% in 2014 to last year a high of 25% on the winter run steelhead. Excuse me. So this is a little more comprehensive. It just is the adjusted estimates of salmonids consumed at Bonneville Dam between 2002 and 2017. You can see sort of on, it's got all pinnipeds, California sea lions, and Steller sea lions. The blue area is when the pinniped removal program went into place with the first letter of authorization. At that time, the California sea lion predation was, roughly 3% and started to progress downward for a few years. And that has, had a pretty big uptick there in 2015 and 16, but that also overlaps with that large influx of California sea lions into the Columbia River estuary, where there was sort of just, 3,000 to 4,000 animals coming in. Last year, that predation went down quite a bit, but I think if you'll notice, you can see the trend there with Steller sea lions has been going in an upward direction. And if you look at, in 2017, if you look at Steller sea lions and you look at the estimated salmonid catch and the percent run taken, it's pretty close to the numbers for California sea lions back in 2006 when the states sent us an application requesting authorization for lethal removal. So I just wanted to give a little bit of kind of an overview of a risk summary. It's really these spring and summer runs, particularly the spring runs here. On the left side of the graph are different populations. On the right side are different major population groups within some of these ESUs. And you can see that these early returning fish are likely more susceptible to a higher level of predation than just the aggregated percentages, and also that there are many of these runs that are some of the most severely depressed within the basin. So over the course of 10 years, the states have removed 190 animals. 7 of those were accidental mortalities, so 183 were intentionally lethally removed. Sort of a summary of the impacts on the salmonid fishery stocks, and these are minimum consumption estimates. California sea lions for the 10-year period is 53 to 54,000 salmonids. When you take both of the pinniped species, that jumps up to 68,000. So one of the things that's required when the state submits an application is, to identify the expected benefits of the lethal removal. And so in our 2008 environmental assessment, we looked at the range of alternatives. This was the alternative that was selected. And you can see that there's a range of estimates there on numbers and percentages. There are minimums and maximums based on just the variability in run size over time. And it looks at, the listed stocks, but it also looks at non-listed stocks and the aggregate of those two. And then the states have also done some bioenergetics modeling to look at how many fish may have been saved due to lethal removals. And it's important to point out that this is really, as a bioenergetic models, that it's really an estimate of food requirements, and it's not consumption, but it's what are the minimum calories per day on average that an animal needs to maintain its metabolism. So you can see, you know, that range comes up between 23 and 29,000 fish would be an estimated number of salmonids that had been saved. So I think if you look at this and asking are there some expected benefits of the taking, you know, the EA has a range of the minimum and maximums of 2,100 to maybe 23,000 fish. You compare that to the bioenergetics estimates, and that gets you 23 to 29,000 fish. I think it's probably pretty difficult to be able to point out, if you look at the return of spring Chinook, how many of those were those fish that were estimated as part of that benefit. But I think that that's something that we would see, is that there is a benefit to the removal program in terms of the potential increase in salmonids. So I think to get close to wrapping this up, you know, is the problem interaction going away? And I think it's pretty clear that the answer is no. And in fact, as you can see from the earlier presentations this morning, that it's likely getting worse. I think you can look at the stellar sea lions at Bonneville Dam. You can look at the predation issues that are going on in Puget Sound. So that leaves us with, you know, what management options are available under the MMPA. And right now we've been exercising Section 120, but there are other options under the MMPA listed here. None of them are easy. They're all very difficult and complicated and expensive and take a lot of staff and time, and don't necessarily have, you know, absolute certainty in their execution. So I would say that, you know, if you're asking if the lethal removal program is working to at least minimize the interaction, I would say yes, but I would say that the program could benefit from some targeted improvements to sort of help, you know, kind of execute the program maybe in a more efficient manner. Thank you.
Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to move straight to Brian's talk, and Brian is with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I think this one is you.
Yes.
Okay, all yours.
Okay. Thanks, Jason, and thanks for the commission for the invitation to participate in the session. Just quickly, I'm going to be talking about the situation at Willamette Falls, which actually predates Bonneville, but it's kind of come full circle. A lot of people have been involved in this work. I just want to mention Robin Brown, who's the ODFW's longtime marine mammal program leader. A lot of you know him. He recently retired, and I'm just the acting program leader now, and that new leader will be coming on board pretty soon. Willamette Falls, if you're not familiar with it, it's just upriver of Portland, near the cities of West Linn and Oregon City. It's about 128 miles from the Pacific Ocean, about 72 river miles around the corner from Bonneville Dam. It's a combination hydroelectric dam and natural falls. There's 2 ESA-listed stocks of fish there, the upper Willamette winter steelhead and the upper Willamette spring Chinook. There are hatchery runs as well of summer steelhead and a hatchery spring Chinook run. There's lamprey, white sturgeon, some other fish that go through there. And the issue we've had is mostly with California sea lions, but here too, stellar sea lions are becoming an increasing concern. Most of the haul-out substrate that they use up there is artificial, marinas and docks, but there are some natural rock outcroppings that they use as well. Just a little bit of background. California sea lions, there's some records from the 1940s and 50s, but they really started showing up there consistently in the mid-1990s. Our agency did some limited monitoring then. There's 3 different fish ladders that the fish use to go through the falls that were put in the 1970s. The sea lions, just like up at Bonneville Dam, it entered those fish ladders, and these sea lion exclusion devices, which you see in the picture there, were put on all the fish ladders to prevent them from going in. And that's still a favorite foraging spot for these animals. That picture was just from a couple weeks ago. In the 2000s, we shifted, once sea lions started showing up in large numbers at Bonneville Dam, our agency, we shifted our resources there in cooperation with WDFW and the Corps to try to get a handle on that situation. In the meantime, in the late 2000s, the California sea lion numbers at Willamette did start to increase, and that was coupled with some very low run years for the winter steelhead. So in this decade, so at the beginning of this decade, our agency implemented increasingly intense hazing programs, early 2010, 11, and 13. Those were largely ineffective, and so we switched to a more rigorous, trying to get rigorous data subsequent to that, and we're now finished, we just finished up our 5th year as of this coming Friday. Like Robert said, the state of Oregon applied for a Section 120 authorization at the end of last year, and then at the beginning of this year, we initiated a trapping and relocation program. These gives you the index of sort of the trend in California sea lion abundance at the falls, and the measure here is simply the maximum single day California sea lion count. So 1995 to the early 2000s, it was always, on any one day, it was less than 10. Over the course of the season, you could have more individuals going through, but those were the maximum counts. Portland State University did some observations there after we left, and then those numbers jumped up into that 10 to 20 range. And then the 4 dots there are 2014 to 17 for our most recent observation program. This year, 2018, I don't have all the data yet, but from what I've heard from our observers, our single one-day count this year was 35, so it dropped down a little bit. This is some data from 2016. This just shows kind of how the population kind of builds over the season. Each year that we've done this, we've started earlier and earlier, because each time we start, the sea lions were already there. So then we said, okay, next year we're going to start a month earlier, but they're already there. So the last 2 years we've been starting in January, but in effect, the first sea lions start showing up in September. We just don't have the money to cover that whole season. So you could draw this line out from February here pretty much all the way back to about October or so, and it bounces around 5 to 10 animals from about October on. The last California sea lions just left over the weekend as they all head out on their southward migration back to the breeding grounds. This is a graph of the winter steelhead passage at the falls. So all of these fish go through the falls, and they're counted at a window, just like at a lot of the dams, like at Bonneville. And this just shows the trend since 1970, generally down. And 2017, that last dot there, that was the lowest passage on record. It was 822 fish. This year, as of a few days ago, it was double that. It was about 1,700. And the run's just about done, so it shouldn't get too much more than that. This is what we do up there for the monitoring. There's a couple highlights on the slide there. We have an observer at various vantage points. They're counting predation events. The falls we have gridded up into 6 1-hectare areas, and the observation unit is 30 minutes. So we get essentially we're just getting an average predation rate, and then we expand that over all the sites and times that could have been sampled. These are the results from the past 4 years. Total salmonid predation varied from a low last year of about 2,700, which reflects just the low runs last year, to a high of about 5,800 in 2015. If you break that out into the different runs, which I do based on the window count composition, our main concern is the listed winter steelhead. And you can see the numbers there. Again, last year, fewer fish taken, but it was such a low run size that had the highest percent of escapement taken. The caveat, or the one thing to note here, is that it's not quite an apples to apples comparison. Each year, the sampling frame varies a little bit. 2014 and 15, those estimates apply from the falls down to the Clackamas River, which is about 2.5 miles. Due to budget cuts, we just focused on the falls for the last 3 years, 16, 17, 18. So those estimates only apply to the falls. In general, based on those first 2 years when we had more spatial coverage, the falls made up about 60% of that total predation. I mentioned, too, that we're monitoring for longer and longer periods. So 14 was only 3 months, whereas now we're up to 5 months. So additional adjustments need to be made to really do an apples-to-apples kind of comparison there. As far as the effect on fish, I have a colleague, Matt Falsey, that's done a population viability analysis for the winter steelhead run. And what this shows, the winter steelhead run can be further broken up into specific populations in the Willamette Valley based on where they go to spawn. And that's how our agency manages them. North Santiam, South Santiam, Malala, and the Kalapuya. And going down in rows are various increasing levels of predation, from kind of no predation, the baseline rate, what the probability of extinction would be over 100 years, given all the other threats that they face, and then increasing pinniped predation or sea lion predation. Kalapuya aside, which is a very small population that's going to go out regardless, you can see the effect of increasing pinniped predation. And the probability that any one of those 3 main populations going extinct over that time period is nearly 90% at those highest levels of predation. Like I mentioned, we, with the assistance and funding from NIMS, we were able to build some new traps. We installed those this year near the haul out. And the objective there was, because of the critical kind of situation with winter steelhead, we're trying to buy the fish a little bit of time. The idea of, we relocated sea lions to the coast, the Central Oregon coast. We would hope that would buy a few weeks of time per individual. But we were also trying to develop our procedures because, even though we've done this other places, each situation is unique. Over about 5 weeks in February and March, we trapped 11 individuals. There's a fair amount of interchange between Bonneville and Willamette. We did catch one animal on the Bonneville removal list here, so that animal was euthanized. The other 10 animals we took to just south of Newport. It's about a 230-mile swim. One of those, they all came back, so one animal got a ride twice. The quickest return, the very first animal that we relocated, came back in 4 days. So we expected them based on the experience at Ballard and some relocations we did at Bonneville. We thought they would return, but that was a bit disheartening. 4 days later, it was back. Almost all of them came back within a week. There was one that maybe took a month. And then just to wrap up, our application, which the commission has commented on, and the task force will deliberate in August, is a little bit different than what we currently have at Bonneville. The main criteria that we operate under at Bonneville, the animals have to be uniquely identifiable. We do that primarily through branding. They have to meet a residency requirement of being seen for at least 5 days, not continuously, but over any period of time. They have to be documented eating at least one salmonid. And then at Bonneville, both of those things have to happen to get on the list, and they have to be exposed to hazing. So some of the differences that we requested, at least in our application, is that a reduction in the number of days. And then rather than meeting the 2 conditions of residency and predation, we requested or. because the main hang-up at Bonneville, like we'll probably talk about, is getting an animal on the list. It takes a long time to document them eating a fish, and it's not that they're not eating fish, it's just when they eat a fish, you can almost never see the brand or the mark that makes them identifiable. So that process can take weeks and weeks. And then just given our long experience and others with hazing, we requested not having to do any hazing there. And with that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Brian. You gained us back a little bit of time, but I still think we're going to move right into Mike's talk. After Mike's talk, we're going to have a break, and then we're going to have a panel discussion where there'll be a lot of time, I think ample time for questions for all of these three, but also some other panelists that will be up. So Mike Gosseliner is the General Counsel for the Marine Mammal Commission, and he's going to talk about pending legislation related to this topic.
Thank you. And just to provide, I guess, a little additional framework, is that this is going to be followed by panel discussion, and I think we're hoping that the panelists will talk about what's working, what's not working, and what we might be doing differently to make things work better. So that's kind of the goal behind my talk, is to discuss at least what the pending legislation is, which is one of the thoughts on what might work better. Let's see. So I'm starting out with a little map of the lower Columbia River here, and let's see if I can get this to move. Yeah. Okay. So and there's like 50 people in this room that know more about the Columbia River and the tributaries and everything and where the salmon are than I do. So ask them the questions. But basically, there's a very wide initial section with presumably lots of pinnipeds in this section. I do want to scroll down here, and you'll note that there's various little tributaries, and this will become apparent in a minute why this is relevant. Also, I want to point out right here, there's a road that crosses the river here, and there's a little island called Government Island. So you've got, to give you some context, there's Vancouver and Portland, and then to the east of that, right in here is mile marker, or river mile about 112, which is what's referenced in the legislation. So that's quite a ways up the river, and then Bonneville Dam is all the way over at the end of the shaded area here. So with that as background, there are two companion bills currently under consideration, one in the House, one in the Senate. They're virtually identical bills. Both would amend Section 120 of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The House bill is a little further along in process. They have had hearings on it. This isn't the first iteration of this bill. It's been considered in the past, at least the past two Congresses, maybe the past three. So the idea has been floating around for a while to amend the MMPA to make the process easier or more streamlined, depending upon your characterization of this. The House bill has been reported out. I think that was back in February, maybe end of January. So if you go on the congress.gov website, you can find that report. Both bills are still being negotiated, and two of the panelists, at least two of the panelists, are involved in some of those discussions and probably know more about the state of those discussions and what changes might happen to this legislation than I do. So they will be able to speak to that. Basically, the differences between the process, and you heard both Brian and Robert talk about kind of the process that they have to go through. You have to be able to identify the animals individually, so they're doing a lot of branding. Some have natural marks. You have to see them eating fish. You have to note that they're at the dam for a certain number of days. So it is fairly intensive from the management perspective of checking all the boxes. So the proposed legislation would ease up on those things. So they would allow permits to be issued to 9 different entities, 3 states, so it's Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and 6 tribes or tribal organizations. Each permit could allow the taking of lethal removal, which is how we're using taking here, of up to 100 animals, and the total could be at 10% of PBR. So right now, the California sea lion PBR is 9,200, so that would be 920 California sea lions that could be removed. And stellar sea lions, since they're not ESA listed and not depleted, they would also be included, so essentially 250 of those. So we're talking upping right now the total that can be taken annually at Bonneville is 92 animals, 1% of PBR. So this would increase the total number of stellars and California sea lions combined to 1,170-ish, depending upon how you round. It would also do away or change the requirement that animals be individually identifiable. Anything that would be found in one of those lower tributaries where endangered or threatened salmonids spawn, and my understanding, and again, these guys are the experts, is that essentially all of those tributaries below the mile 112 marker meet that criterion. And then anything found upstream of mile 112, so at that island and on up, if you're there, you're automatically individually identifiable. You don't have to be there for a certain number of days. You don't need any markings. You're on the list. And it also does away with there's no longer a significant negative impact criterion as there is in the current provision. Essentially, there's an assumption that if you're there, you're a significant contributor to the problem. One other thing this would do is it expands the fish stocks that you're protecting from just ESA-listed salmon to include, quote, other non-listed fish species. So I think the goal was to include lampreys and sturgeon, as Brian mentioned in his list. Those are of concern, but it's also fairly open-ended that it could be other fish species beyond those, and presumably you could be protecting them not just because you're worried about their continued existence or it's a conservation problem, but presumably you could also protect them for fishery purposes. So it's fairly broad language. And I've kind of, these are obviously related to the other points I just made, but procedure, I've kind of broken these into procedures that once an application is submitted, the Secretary of Commerce or NIMS would have 30 days to approve or disapprove it. So it would be a very streamlined process. You wouldn't have a task force set up like you do now and drag out the authorization process for months or sometimes longer than that. Because it's such a short turnaround, having NEPA compliance would be problematic. You really can't turn around a NEPA document in 30 days, so there would be a 5-year exemption from NEPA. And another thing is that the permit authorities, I said there could be 9 entities, each getting a permit for 100 animals. I also think the way I interpret it is that you could have one entity get 9 permits in a single year, but sequentially, that I don't think there's a limit, because obviously otherwise the limit would be 900 animals instead of 1,170 animals that you could remove in a given year. But the process is that, for instance, Idaho could come in and get a permit, and there really isn't any place to remove pinnipeds up in Idaho, so presumably they could the Idaho authorities could come down to Oregon and get authority to remove animals there, or they could transfer their permit that allows them to take 100 animals to allow Oregon to take them on their behalf. So it's kind of a fungible permit process between the 9 entities that could get them. And with that, these are just some of the questions that occurred to me as I was walking through the legislation that we might want to ask the panelists, which is how many pinnipeds actually occur in those tributaries or in the section of the Columbia River that would be subject to the removals. It's like if there are only 300 that go in those a year, why do you need authority to take 1,100, for instance? So I know numbers are one of the things that's in flux. What evidence do we have that all the animals in that area where you can take them really are significant contributors? Why did they pick mile marker 112 instead of some other mile marker? How would the removals be accomplished? That right now you heard about how they're removing animals at Bonneville and proposing to do it at Willamette, and can you really remove a large number of animals if that's the methodology you're using? Are the entities that could get permits the appropriate ones? As I said, Idaho doesn't have pinnipeds, and where some of these tribes are also aren't where the pinnipeds are currently the problem. Also, just looking at the procedures, why have multiple entities getting permits if the whole goal is to just transfer them to a couple entities that will do the removing? So I think there's perhaps some needless complication in the procedures there. But if you did issue 9 of them, how would those 9 entities coordinate their activities? Would they all be out there at the same time? Would they be acting independently, or essentially how would they coordinate? And then also the last question of what fish stocks are we really concerned about? And lampreys and white sturgeon are already on the table, but what other things are people thinking about? So that's just prelude to the discussion we'll have after the break.
Okay, I think we're going to just leave this slide up, and so we can refer to it after the break. I think we'll, again, defer questions until we have the full panel. Everybody can have some coffee and think about their questions. And I'd like to ask Chairman Darrell, like, what time would you like? We were gonna be back at 10:30 and have an hour and a half for the panel. So why don't you think about when you'd like people back?
Let's, we'll split the difference. We'll give a 5-minute extra length break and be back.
All right, so 10:35, be back here.